This is the third part of the lecture from Public Management, Week 2, the Organizational Enterprise. The concepts we're going to be looking at first are the concept of the outcome and impact of system activity and how that relates to system alignment. So we looked earlier at the input-output graph, and we could see here that we have an output of firefighting activity, which is that the fire is out. More precisely, we might think of the types of outcomes of fire activity, including putting a fire out, saving property, saving actual lives, but also things that are a little bit related to firefighting activity, but less direct, like inspections and education. Now, the desired impacts of firefighting are, if one thinks about it, safer citizens, right? So firefighting is inherently a public safety activity. And in the case of lives saved, property saved, those two desired impacts actually correspond very nicely to the program outputs. We'd like to keep people safer, we'd like to save their lives, we'd like to save their property, and in fact, that is what happens when someone physically fights a fire. It's a little bit trickier, though, when we think about other types of firefighting activity, which the goal of which is, in fact, to avoid fires, or at least avoid severe losses associated with fires. There, fire safety inspections, fire safety education, it's hard to know that every single time you go to a training, you've definitely avoided one fire, or you've sort of cut the losses that you might have from a fire in half. The same, if you have 100 inspections, how many fires have you actually avoided? You don't know because you never have them. And so this is one of the reasons that we consider basically the alignment between program input and program impact, because when those two things are misaligned, as they are in the case of firefighting inspections and firefighting education, with the desired program impacts, people can get cranky because they basically don't see the point of doing, what good is an inspection? It costs money, but it's not necessarily saving any lives. It's not necessarily putting out a fire. And one of the ways we might also think about this alignment is in terms of the target population. So we could think about the actual alignment of impacts and outputs, but we can also think about alignment in terms of the target population. So firefighters their goal is to provide safety for citizens, is the target population, and also when they're fighting fires, those are the people that they're helping. So they're directly helping the citizens they're supposed to help. However, it's not always the case that we see that. So if you're inspecting a building, there you're dealing with a business. They're the target population of your activity, even though the target population for the desired impact is a citizen. And so this is whenever you have different target populations, and it's again a symptom of an unaligned system. So program outcomes not equaling program impacts. Target populations of the activity may not be the target population of the program impact. These are the types of things that we would look for as characteristics of unaligned systems as opposed to aligned systems. You might also see that some establishment members or some target population members, just some member of the group of people that is in some way associated with the activity, are largely passive. And when you see people being passive, but they're in some way supposed to be involved, that again says there's something about the activity that's not bringing in the core people that you need. What tends to be the number one system of that? There's a very common expression when you talk about educational testing, and it's very widespread in the UK, of this concept of hitting the target but missing the point. So one might have all of your students in class for 1,090 hours a year, or whatever the hourly targets are, but they might not learn anything during that time, in which case you've hit the target, but you've missed the point. Or you might have many students getting an 80% on an educational standardized test, but if that test isn't testing the right things, again, you might hit the target, but miss the point. However, in an aligned system, if you actually try different performance management techniques, they're much more likely to be successful. So what are the symptoms that we might recognize if we're reading a case? And if we see these symptoms, we might think, ooh, maybe the underlying features that we're concerned about, or system characteristics that we're concerned about, are in fact problems of system alignment. So One symptom of an aligned system might be that it's difficult to control desired outcomes and impacts because you have limits on the boundaries of authority. So you might be trying to ensure safer citizens, but you can't keep them from putting electric heaters into their or using electric blankets or putting sort of dangerous gas propane heaters into their homes. So no matter how much education and how much training you do, there's still going to be some fool who puts the propane heater right next to an open flame. And sure enough, the fire's going to start anyway. Another type of symptom you might see is frustration directed towards lazy or irresponsible members of the establishment. So again, of this community of people in some way connected to the activity. As I just illustrated, whenever I said some stupid person, some irresponsible person, right, might leave an open flame right next to a propane heater and start a fire. That's exactly an illustration of what I mean. Anytime you find yourself getting that type of language and getting that type of frustration, it makes the point that that's exactly what you expect in an unaligned system. And you might also see sporadic eruptions of conflict around sort of hot button issues. But unless the system becomes more aligned, and in some cases it's almost impossible to align systems, but unless you can improve the alignment, you'll often continue to have these. The big threat and complication, of course, from a public manager's point of view, is on the one hand, loss of legitimacy. So it might be basically seen that you're incapable of doing the public, providing the public good or service that you are expected to provide. Or, again, an undermining of legitimacy in the case of regulations when you're going in and you're trying to prevent something that's quite remote from the actual activity of regulation that you are engaged in. You, again, will typically be seen as less legitimate, say, than those hardworking all-American firefighters. There's also a problem of interest group capture, which I'll be talking more about and explaining more in future weeks. Some of you may be, though, familiar with the concept of interest group capture if you've taken any classes on legislative politics. So basically the same, or bureaucratic politics, the idea of an iron triangle of interest group capture might be quite familiar. An aligned system, on the other hand, you aren't going to have problems. You're not going to get aligned system as cases, maybe as successful outcomes of the cases, but not as the initial starting conditions of a case. In aligned systems, people typically feel a high sense of job satisfaction. They put a lot of effort in because they're getting that immediate reward. And it feels sort of like we're all in the same team fighting the same fight. We aren't working at cross purposes. Ironically, even highly aligned systems, though, can in fact present certain threats and complications. The one, I guess one could say, sort of negative aspect of a highly aligned system is it typically is quite costly because there needs to be a decent amount of ongoing coordination and communication. So it's difficult to keep things in alignment whenever people don't have the time to meet and get basically working on the same page on a regular basis. Also, you can end up actually with a system that when the external environment starts to shift, a concept we'll be returning to later in the lecture, in essence, there's such a emphasis on consensus that people are no longer able to recognize the environmental changes that are taking place. In addition, it might be that these types of environmental changes or new gray space means that there is no way that anyone knows exactly whose job is whose and what they are supposed to be doing. So there's a pretty quick and easy way to think about how we can bring these different concepts we've learned together into an easy way to think about evaluation and evaluating different options we might have for changing a work process. The first question we might want to ask ourselves is, does the system balance system efficiency and robustness? Now, this is true in general about systems, and it's something that's always good to keep in mind. But more importantly, what we're going to think about is, if you're familiar with the idea of a SWOT, which is the idea of listing out strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But I'd always found SWOTs a bit difficult because it's very imprecise, right? You sort of list them out, but there's no good evaluative criteria. So what I'm going to do here is describe to you a slightly modified SWOT, in which the criteria are much clearer. So the first is in thinking about strengths. We want to think about whether the change we're going to suggest, the options we're going to consider, preserves or enhances organizational strengths or the core value added mission. So notice that we can actually map out this value add using our value adding function. And just to consider then, like looking back at the town librarian case, what we can see is that in several cases, we see words like expansion, overstepping role, outside competencies. These are all indicators that in essence, we are going outside of our value added mission and not really building on our strengths. When you look at the column here where I've evaluated the different options and you look at the idea that something is within constraints, which is both the keeping kids out option and the slight alteration options, you can see there, yes, in both cases, you are in fact building on the strengths. Of course, with the keeping kids out, in a sense, there actually is some undermining of that strength because you aren't doing what the librarian ultimately decides to do, which is to focus on this core mission of enhancing learning, enhancing knowledge, and therefore using the library resources to do so and not simply thinking of ourselves as a daycare. Another issue is, instead of thinking about weaknesses, what you really want to think about is the change within our existing bounds of authority, i.e., is this within the scope of things that we might want to be able to do? And the idea of scope of authority was actually a big topic of conversation in our last discussion section. One way to think about this is we can think about the outputs versus the impacts. So sometimes there are desired impacts we might have that are outside of our scope. Again, remember, this is a symptom of a misaligned system. But in other cases, we might want to think about things within our scope. So, for example, anything that involves a dramatic expansion of role, in the case of the town librarian, or as some of you might have pointed out, something that requires authorization by the town meeting. These options are a little bit less attractive, in essence, because they are not within the current scope of the authority of the manager of the town librarian. Opportunities, what you're often looking for, are not just all opportunities, but opportunities for greater alignment between program outputs and program impacts. Again, the criteria is a bit more precise because we've seen that system misalignment is one of the major causes of a lot of the symptoms that we're going to see of systems that need some sort of a change. Again, in the case of the librarian, we can think that, in fact, the option she ultimately chose was one that actually did speak to this core mission, and it brought something that might have been considered as nothing more than just taking care of kids that showed up back into the core mission, an opportunity for greater alignment between the actual outputs of the program, i.e. patrons served, and the desired impact, which is a lifelong love of learning. Finally, the last of the SWOTs, we won't really talk much about this week, but we'll get to next week, which is the idea of threat. In particular, whether or not the ideas, whether or not any of the options we're considering threaten the existing establishment. We'll see that threatening the status quo is a major issue for the establishment in general.